Hello and welcome. Today we're going to focus on the role that clinical engineers in the UK have played in the fight against COVID-19. We'll hear from people across the UK about how this vital group, who were used to working quietly behind the scenes, was suddenly thrust into the spotlight, responding to a previously unimaginable challenge. But to really understand how this happened, we first need to look at the role of the clinical engineer. If you think about how people in hospitals are cared for, you're probably picturing doctors, nurses, or allied health professionals. But have you ever thought about the equipment they need, where it comes from, and how it's maintained? This work is done by another vital team that patients never see but are critical to their recovery. Clinical engineers. They design, develop, test, maintain and care for all the devices and machines used to treat people in hospital. It's a mammoth task.
A clinical engineer is here to support the hospital.
We look after all the medical devices in the trust.
From trolleys and thermometers to stuff such as monitors and anaesthetic machines.
One of the advantages of our department is that we're actually site-based, we're here.
The whole life cycle of a device comes through us and goes through us.
The contribution of clinical engineering has been extremely useful, like being able to provide safe patient care.
Without clinical engineers, healthcare would quickly grind to a halt, and it all starts way before patients need their help.
We are involved with the procurement team and the trust management to procure the device. We make sure that the right device is purchased at the right price.
And then we also liaise with the manufacturers when there's anything that needs to be done.
And then it will be released into use only once at least 70% of the staff in the hospital have been trained.
Once it is connected to a patient, you feel proud that you are an engineer and you fixed the unit and you're actually saving a life.
It's as far as you can get from simply buying a bit of kit off the shelf. And as the name suggests, most clinical engineers have a background in engineering or physics because designing and building equipment is also a key part of their role.
We have a stringent quality system that is in place that we have to follow to produce any medical device.
We can speed up the repair of a ventilator to be used on a patient. So we'll help not only the clinicians, it will help the patients and the family as well.
So we make sure that we provide high quality standards of maintaining and servicing the equipment.
As the complexity and cost of equipment increases, so do the demands placed on it. Clinical engineers play a vital role in ensuring patients get the best care whilst also delivering the best value for the NHS.
We have to make sure we have the right value for money and the right device at the same time.
We also deal with the IT department and the procurement, the finance, ordering parts.
Also organisations such as MHRA to make sure that the device is regulated before we hand them out.
There was a lot of people, both within the organisation, outside the organisation, and we work together as a whole, as a big team in the department to bring this together.
While rarely in the spotlight, clinical engineers are essential in our health service, and they're passionate about what they do.
Working as a clinical engineer, especially during this time, makes us feel very proud, and it's a very fulfilling role to know that our skills are being put to good use.
We've been working a lot on the ventilator systems.
I'm so happy and proud to be part of providing the patient care.
I'm very proud of the job I do and the team I work with.
That makes me happy.
On the 31st of December 2019, while most of the world was welcoming in the new year, Chinese authorities were alerting the World Health Organization. They were deeply concerned by a cluster of severe pneumonia cases of unknown cause in their central city of Wuhan. Within a matter of weeks, the first cases were being reported in the UK. The Wuhan outbreak had now escalated into a global healthcare emergency. All we knew initially about the infection, which we now know as COVID-19, was that it was highly contagious. It appeared to be a respiratory virus, with the worst affected patients needing ventilation and intensive care. And for half these patients, it was proving fatal. Governments around the world prepared for the worst. It soon became apparent that if the modelling was correct, predicted patient numbers would far outstrip available medical equipment. Procuring and rolling out such highly specialised equipment on the scale required was a daunting task. It also needed a level of coordination which simply didn't exist at that time. I'm joined by Ruth Thompson, Scientific Director for NHS London. Ruth, when did you first realise the enormity of this challenge?
I was privy to being part of the medical directorate in London and therefore very much involved in the planning stage when we started to hear about this flu virus that was coming from China. So we were understanding as it unravelled within our own hospitals the scale and the speed of which this virus was beginning to hit our population. The challenge for us was going to become really obvious really quickly that we needed to do something differently. We needed a huge amount of beds, and those beds needed to be critical care beds. I heard, and I've made a note of this, there's a procurement frenzy going on and some real command and control behaviours around how we needed to get stock out to support patients who were really seriously ill in critical care.
Why couldn't existing channels of communication cope?
So this wasn't just about communication, this was about the whole way in which we used to do business. What was happening with the procurement challenge was we'd gone from a local procurement system to a national procurement system where we were buying competitively across the globe. And we had people involved like the army in terms of how we helped distribute. And we had to ask for support and help from other colleagues outside of the NHS in this space. So we had to establish a very different way of working, and including in that way of working a different way of networking and a different way of delivering and building a supply chain in order to support our patients in critical care.
How did you approach building networks, both in London and nationally?
Well, it was a huge collaboration. I remember, first of all, writing out to a group of people I had working with me who were healthcare science fellows. They were in their first year of fellowship working in a regional space. And as a regional lead, they were my resource. So I wrote to them and called them all onto a Teams meeting and said, we're going to have to stop the day job and we're all going to have to pull together and work our hardest to see how we can support the COVID challenge. The clinical engineering workforce seem a really vital part in order to help with the supply chain and help with the onboarding of equipment. So I feel that we really need to try to reach out across the system and build a clinical engineering network. In amongst my fellows were 3 clinical engineers, so I was uniquely placed with those people who had been working out into a system already to have that system knowledge. That connected with the support from IPEM and the release of some of the email addresses which normally we can't get access to. We work collaboratively to build a network around London, and I'll never forget the first call where we invited clinical leads within clinical engineering to a network meeting, and we had over 50 people on a call, and that was the first movement into working with the clinical engineers en masse. Another piece of work I did was to call in the Royal College of Engineers, because I had the good fortune to meet someone who was working in that space. And I called her and said, I really think we're going to have to work together to see what the engineering workforce can do to support this challenge.
Ruth, thanks for now. Now, with plans being drawn up at pace, the initial focus was purely on getting enough equipment for the anticipated patient numbers. With everybody working flat out, it was all hands to the pump. Keith Eisen, retired president of the Institute of Physics and Engineering in Medicine, IPEM, found himself back in the fray, providing clinical engineering expertise to government. Keith, how did you become involved?
I got a call from Ruth Thompson, who's the lead healthcare scientist in London, wanting some support with clinical engineering, particularly linking people together and also talking to the Cabinet Office procurement work stream, because they had lots of people who knew about procurement, but not so many people who knew about clinical engineering, and particularly clinical engineering within the NHS.
What was the mood and how challenging was it at this time?
It was very frenetic and decisions were being made at a very fast pace. There were problems getting equipment internationally because there was so much competition, many countries wanting to get their hands on the same equipment at the same time. And so getting the specifications of what was wanted in the NHS was difficult. So a whole range of equipment was ordered that came in, and that had to then be looked at by clinical engineers to see what was going to be most suitable for use in the NHS.
How many ventilators were needed, and how did you think you were going to go about getting them?
The original number of ventilators in the NHS wasn't perfectly known, so an inventory was taken which showed that there were about 8,000 to 9,000 that could be put into use in an emergency. The worst projections were that 30,000 would be needed, and so there was a real shortfall. Therefore, a lot of activity went into trying to purchase ventilators from overseas, which in itself was a challenge because of the competition for getting equipment from other countries. That made it difficult for both the people procuring the equipment and for the engineers receiving it, that they couldn't always be sure what was going to come.
What was the ventilator challenge?
The government issued a challenge in the middle of March to companies to come up with new designs of ventilators that could be rapidly manufactured. And that was successful in that a number of consortia got together with fairly straightforward designs that could be manufactured quickly. The production of those was ramped up, and by the end of the first phase of the pandemic, a number of those ventilators had gone into use. And there are more of them now in a stockpile so that we can use them against a second surge.
Had clinical engineers been considered during all these planning phases?
The short answer is no, because there were so many operational problems that had to be sorted out to get the ventilators delivered into the UK, that really putting them into service was the second priority. There was an assumption that clinical engineers would be able to cope as they always had done. And so I thought that it will be fine. They'll manage to make it work when the equipment gets there. However, there were some fairly serious issues when the equipment arrived that meant that wasn't possible, particularly getting spare parts and additional consumables to make it work. So clinical engineers were able, through the contacts we established with the Cabinet Office, to look at equipment coming in and to raise issues and to help sort it out so that equipment could be put into use as quickly and effectively as possible.
Thanks for now, Keith. Getting lots of equipment on loan from the many organisations anxious to help in any way they could sounds an ideal solution, but the practicalities were to prove far from simple. Ruth Thompson's now joined by clinical engineer David Stell. What kind of organisations were offering equipment, or what organisations were you going to?
I was first asked, could we work with the Royal College of Veterinary Surgeons to see if we could take ventilators out of veterinary services, which was a really good suggestion because they use our equipment once we've finished using it. So it wasn't such a silly idea. So we worked with the Royal College of Veterinary to see if that would work. And then the independent sector, the private hospitals, and being in London, we have a huge number of those. And our medical director and regional director spoke with and set up a contract with the private sector for us to be able to loan stock from them to get us through the crisis and the surge.
What was the response?
Both were hugely supportive. You must remember the time was quite scary. Everybody was doing what they could. It was a kind of spirit like Dunkirk, where people wanted to help and support. Barriers were being broken down left, right and centre. So the independent sector were instantly in a big conversation with the NHS England director, and we were able to use their premises and their services for non-COVID patients, but also to then start to use their equipment for our critical care patients. The veterinary surgeons worked also with us to make sure that we were happy, not only that we weren't detrimental to animal welfare, but also that we were able to use the equipment in a safe and controlled manner.
So what's the problem?
So there were a few difficulties. One of the difficulties was the complexity of the supply chain. Usually when we purchase equipment, there's just a few organisations involved. So there might be a manufacturer, a supplier, and then the hospital that's purchased it. In this case, there were lots and lots of different manufacturers, suppliers. The equipment was shipped between intermediate locations before it got to hospitals. And then once it was in hospitals, it might be shipped between hospitals, and eventually it would need to be shipped back again. So a much more complicated supply chain. And the second difficulty was related to what we call standardization. Normally we try very hard to make sure that there are a small number of different types of equipment within a hospital so that staff are familiar with the equipment. But during this crisis we received a huge range of different types of equipment, which did increase the risk of mistakes slightly.
What did you do to solve that?
So there are a couple of things that we did to solve that first problem relating to the supply chain. So we found a single logistics provider who was able to do almost all of the transportation and a lot of the storage, which meant that most of the information was stored in one place. With the second problem, we created a system which would allow hospitals to feed back to allocators which types of equipment they particularly wanted in their hospital to reduce the variety in different hospitals.
How much equipment was borrowed?
I didn't have the list. It was a logistically huge amount of work. So every single trust in London was supported in one way or another by the loan stock work that happened across London. So huge amounts, maybe 300-400 ventilators.
Thanks both. Loaned equipment wasn't nearly enough to fill the gap. It had to be purchased as well from right around the globe, and at a time when the whole world wanted it. In the scramble for equipment, existing procurement procedures had to be bypassed. Machines were found, but they were often what were euphemistically called exotic equipment, which brought with it a whole heap of new challenges. Professor Dan Clark, consultant clinical engineer, together with Beth Beeson and their team in Nottingham, were the people who had to sort it out. Dan, exotic equipment sounds very fancy. What exactly is it?
Well, at the start of the pandemic, it became obvious early on that we weren't going to be able to get enough equipment from the standard NHS routes. So the government sourced equipment from all around the globe to bring in to support the NHS at that time of crisis. Much of this equipment was built not to NHS standards and became known as the exotics.
So what was the problem with all this new equipment?
So the problem with these exotics is because they're not normally sold into the UK and not normally brought by the NHS, they don't necessarily fit with the standards that we are used to in this country, but also they just might not actually fit with the hospital trust. So in terms of gas supplies and consumables, it just might not work with our local infrastructure.
How much kit were you expecting to deal with?
Well, at the start of the project, we anticipated perhaps half a dozen ventilators coming through this route. But by the end of it, we'd looked at more than 45 different items of equipment, ventilators and infusion devices.
And what was the process?
So it pretty much ended up down at MOD Donington. We at that point had no idea what was there. So it was a case of them deciding what they were going to send us and just see what arrived. Sometimes we had some advance notice and sometimes we didn't.
How did you feel faced with such a mountain of equipment?
It was quite nerve-wracking, the experience of wondering exactly what equipment we had, whether it was what we might have expected, and actually unboxing it to see exactly what it consisted of and whether it was what we would like to see for use.
You've got all the equipment, but what do you have to do next before it can be made available to the patient?
Well, the technical due diligence team examined the core aspects of equipment that we would normally do before deploying it to clinical use in the NHS. So we ran through a range of tests and evaluations to see if the equipment could be used within an NHS setting.
Give me an idea of how long it normally takes to get a ventilator through its paces and then through due diligence. And how long was it taking now?
Well, under normal circumstances, we might take weeks or even months to evaluate a number of ventilators for use in the NHS, selecting the most effective ones and the most cost-effective devices for use in the NHS environment. In these cases, we didn't have that amount of time, so we were doing the technical due diligence work in a day or sometimes a couple of days.
What were the sorts of problems you were identifying?
There were a range of problems we identified throughout the process. Commonly, the devices had not been made to UK standards, so fittings, hoses, mains and gas pipes were non-standard to the UK. But we came across a range of things. Some consumables weren't available. Some of the consumables were in short supply and couldn't be bought. The devices were built to a range of qualities, some well below the expectations of the NHS.
How did you address them?
So the problems we found, we reported. For each and every device, we provided a short report which looked at what the technical issues were and what would be needed to deploy that device safely in terms of remedial actions. In some cases, we had to say that we did not recommend deployments at all. It was a huge task, and I think we were all immensely proud of what we achieved. Turning around so many devices in such a little amount of time, especially during a pandemic where there was other pressing matters pulling us from our day job. It was a huge task, and I'm just immensely proud of the team that we have around us at Nottingham and how well we managed to perform.
Thanks very much. So clinical engineers, they're doing what they do best of all, working out how to solve a problem. And those in central government were beginning to see just how vital clinical engineers were in the battle against COVID. Let's go back to Keith Ison. Keith, take us back into the room. Things were changing on an almost hourly basis. What was the mood like?
There was a concern that they weren't in touch with what was going on the ground, particularly knowing the number of ventilators that there were and where the need was. The overriding priority was to get ventilators where there was clinical need. And so matching that up with what could actually be put into operation quickly was the challenge for clinical engineers. So what we were able to do through the National Clinical Engineering Network that we set up was to bring engineers in touch with the centre so that as much information as possible could be fed in to make sure that the right equipment went to the right place. That didn't always happen, and then when things arrived, clinical engineers were involved in sorting out some of the problems on the ground. But by and large, it's been a successful operation.
How important were clinical engineers now considered to be?
As soon as the procurement effort started to get involved with the detail in the system, it became very clear very quickly to the bright people doing it that they needed to involve clinical engineers. So from being on the periphery, clinical engineers became at the centre of the delivery and the way in which the equipment was going to be put into use. They performed a vital role, not only liaising with the centre about procurement, but also locally with the clinical teams, making sure that things could be put into operation safely, that new equipment could be learnt about and they could be trained on, and everything could be put into place as quickly as possible. Clinical engineers were vital to doing that.
Thanks, Keith. Getting through due diligence was just the start. Now all this kit had to reach the patients' bedsides. And the story now moves to Cambridge and Paul White's team. Paul, what problems were there to resolve?
Well, effectively, the fact that the equipment had been purchased and the due diligence had been done was just effectively the start of the process in identifying its use in a clinical setting. One of the challenges was around how we are able to sterilize some of the devices, especially the ventilators with their expiratory blocks. And it's all very well having a whole host of ventilators, but if you aren't able to sterilize them in an appropriate manner, then effectively that means that you have half the number that you might expect you have, because some of them need to be sterilized in between patients in their clinical use.
Wasn't it just a case of talking to the manufacturers?
Well, bearing in mind that a lot of the sources that we obtained the equipment from were overseas, mainly from mainland China and elsewhere. And a lot of these didn't have instruction manuals that were available at the time and in English. So that made it much more difficult.
Your team played a key role in PPE in checking that it was all in order, but you were also very involved in consumables, matching the right consumables to the right bit of kit. What sort of consumables are we talking about here?
Well, the range of consumables was quite extensive, and it sort of ranged from suction catheters to suck out the patient's lungs through to the endotracheal tubes, which go into the patients, which connect to the ventilator tubing, sort of ventilator tubing to lines that for line insertion into the patients.
So do all hospitals not have easy access to these consumables?
In normal times, yes, but unfortunately, dealing with COVID, we were in a completely abnormal situation where the supply chains that we would normally use were not available because of effectively the whole world trying to identify and source this equipment. And what we were therefore trying to do was look at alternatives. Some manufacturers were manufacturing devices that they would never normally have manufactured previously. And it was therefore trying to source this equipment and ensure that it was sufficient and safe to use on patients.
Why was this so challenging?
I think the challenging element was that this is equipment that we weren't used to using, and it was completely different. It came from exotic supply chains that we haven't previously used, and ensuring that the equipment was actually up to scratch and actually met the requirements that are needed for safe patient care.
PPE made lots of headlines in the early part of the crisis. What was the problem as far as you were concerned?
One of the major challenges was that there was all sorts of supplies of PPE coming both locally and nationally from various sources, and suppliers, again, that had never been used either by the NHS or from the local trust. And it was trying to identify, whether this equipment was sufficient and met the appropriate standards. Some of it was pertained to come from reputable manufacturers, but unfortunately, when we looked into it and looked at the standards, they weren't able to meet the standards, or that the notified bodies that the equipment had been through in order to get their sort of CE marking, they'd never actually seen that equipment. So it was a massive, massive challenge to identify what met the requirements in terms of testing and what was safe to use for the staff.
How important is PPE to those working on the front line? And government was prepared to spend lots of money. Why not just buy more of it?
The reason why the PPE is extremely important for the staff is that is the element, the barrier between them and the virus, with patients carrying that virus. So it's extremely important that what it says is actually what it does in reality, because we want to keep our staff safe. And the reason why we couldn't go and actually purchase more of it was bearing in mind that this was a worldwide pandemic. Everybody was trying to source the same equipment in order to keep their staff safe at the same time. And therefore the challenge was identifying it from sources that we wouldn't have normally used and ensuring that it actually met the requirements and testing and safety to keep everybody safe to treat patients.
So what did you have to do?
Well, not only looking at sort of the various standards from around the world and trying to identify whether they were appropriate for the device, but it was also in the practical testing. And an example is with gowns, identifying the waterproofing and looking at the hydrostatic head pressure to identify that they actually met the requirements that were put forward as part of NHS England's specificational requirements.
Thanks. So at this stage, the equipment was tested. It was clean, it was in the right place. But how would frontline staff who might never have seen equipment like this before know which buttons to press? What they needed was rapid and easy access to training materials, and that's where Basit Abdul came in. He's a Healthcare Science Fellow at NHS England and Programme Manager at Barts Health NHS Trust. Basit, what was the challenge around user manuals and instructions?
Generally, every hospital have very standardized equipment in ITU, and all the staff are well aware and trained on those medical devices. However, in response to COVID, they received quite a variety and mix of ventilators and other devices. So we did not have a repository of all the service user manuals and training materials which could be accessed in every hospitals across the country.
How do you acquire the resources?
We explored a number of avenues to acquire various types of training materials, user manuals, and service manuals. In one scenario, our trainees in Liverpool, with first language as Chinese, they helped us translate some user manuals. In another example, our international clinical engineering colleagues through IFMB's WhatsApp group help us resource all the training materials that we were not having here. And also the Cabinet Office procured a company who created 2-page quick guidelines to be printed off and installed on all the medical devices for clinicians' reference purposes.
How did you make the resources available to all the people who needed them?
We found Health Education England's e-learning platform as the ideal place to host all the acquired materials, including training manuals, videos, service and user manuals, contact details of suppliers, and also the quick guidelines. And I'm very thankful to our HEE colleagues who let us keep this platform open access, so we shared the links with our international colleagues to utilize all the resources available. And this sense of community is the source of energy that helped us work day and night. And this is something we want to celebrate on Global Clinical Engineering Day.
Great, Bassett. While much of the public focus was on the national provision of ventilators and PPE, the local challenges felt in every trust were immense, and the response from clinical engineers was incredible. Dr. Didi Akinyui provided support for trusts, initially in London and then nationally. Didi, what was the scale of challenge that the trusts were facing?
For clinical engineers, the scale of the challenge that faced us was really staggering. We had to get to grips with a challenge that we hadn't faced before, with a razor-sharp focus on intensive care units. So we had to really understand which equipment was needed beyond just the ventilators that we'd heard about, that you would have heard about in the press. There were lots of other pieces of equipment that are needed to support ICU patients to deliver the highest level of care. You can think of 15 to 20 pieces of equipment, and that's before you think about consumables and things like the amount of pillows that you might need for a patient to be comfortably lying down for their stay in our hospital. So really starting with ventilators and thinking about monitors and infusion devices, but working our way down to the details, we had to understand where was the supply coming from and how could we get it to the right place at the right time.
What did you do?
So in order to mitigate the challenge, we had to show a lot of ingenuity, and that's where the clinical engineers really came into their own. This meant thinking about the logistics process and setting up, in one case, a medical equipment library, so that when we commission the equipment, it could be deployed, ready to go, and to be collected by ICU staff as we rolled out the expansion. Similarly, we had other people roaming through the hospital to identify equipment that wasn't in use, that we could transfer to that library so it would be more accessible.
How did you roll this out across London and then widely?
So it's really important, and when we came up with these initiatives, we didn't just sit on them. Through our networks, we were engaging with other trusts in London and other trusts throughout the country. And we were able to share this good practice in the hope that where it was appropriate, other hospitals could take that on. But also we could take the principles about what we did, say with the equipment library, and spread those out across more of a network. And that meant setting up that logistics hub as really a bit like a large equipment library for all the trusts to be able to access when they needed to.
Thanks, Didi. So let's hear now from some of those trusts around the UK who had to think on their feet and adapt to this unprecedented challenge. Starting in Nottingham with Mark Westby, Head of Medical Equipment Services at Nottingham University Hospitals NHS Trust. Can you explain the kind of challenge you were facing?
Yes, so we got about 20 critical care beds, and we realised that we would have to increase the capacity to about 200 critical care beds. So we realised we didn't have enough space or equipment to put all these patients into. So there was a lot of planning to make sure we could put these beds into place. We had to convert theatre rooms into critical care bed spaces, so each theatre converted to 4 critical care bed spaces, and we had to make sure we procured the equipment to go into those bed spaces, so not just the beds or the surfaces, but also the patient monitoring and the suction pumps and the infusion devices to go with those.
How do you approach a challenge on that scale?
Well, there's a lot of planning, clinical engineering. were instrumental in a lot of the governance committees and the planning committees, from procurement to oxygen consumption supplies, to reconfiguring physical spaces for gas and oxygen and electricity, and making sure the equipment would fit in those spaces. So it involved a lot of urgent meetings with lots of different stakeholders within the organisation, and it was critical that clinical engineering was involved in those meetings to offer the expert advice to make these things happen.
How did it go? Was it as tough as it sounded? And did you get them all up and running in the end?
Yeah, it was really tough. Obviously, with COVID in place, we had to reconfigure our working areas. We also had people off, self-isolating, and that had got COVID themselves, so we had reduced staff capacity. And at the same time, we was trying to increase the amount of work that we was doing for the organisation. We managed to get all of the bed surge plans in place, the beds in place, and all of the equipment in place, all at the right times. So that was the plan worked really well at this trust.
How are clinical engineers viewed in your trust now?
I think a lot of people, we're kind of in the background and nobody really sees what we're doing, but we just kind of help make things happen in the organisation. So we're here at night and fixing things and making things work. But obviously everyone wanted a piece of us during COVID, and we made sure we reprioritised and had the right amount of time. So I think we've gained a lot of respect from all of our clinical colleagues, and it's really raised the profile of clinical engineering and clinical engineers in this hospital in particular.
Thanks. Let's now speak to Mariam Merjafari from Kingston. Mariam, what was the scale of the problem in Kingston?
We had to increase 18 extra ITU beds in a short period of time using existing equipment in the hospital. Therefore, we had to change some of the equipment to make them adaptable with the new applications, such as changing the anesthetic machines to be used as ventilators, or changing the configuration on infusion devices that coming from theatres and pediatric departments.
And I know you had infrastructure issues to cope with as well.
There were definitely the infrastructure problem because the new ITU department that we started using, it hasn't been designed as an ITU department. Therefore, we didn't have enough electricity plugs for the amount of medical devices that we're supposed to use, and not enough air and oxygen outlets in that department. And definitely it was the oxygen supply problem.
Oxygen's vital, we all know that, but what are the particular issues supplying oxygen creates?
Obviously, each medical devices have the limit for minimum and maximum oxygen consumption, but we weren't really sure how much exactly each medical devices use with specific settings that we are using for the patients. And so we had to go around the hospital checking every single equipment that using the oxygen supply and measuring the consumption using the initiative method. And then it resulted to understanding clearly how much is the consumption. For example, our anesthetic machines that being used as a ventilator were using 15 liters per minute, and we had to make some mechanical changes. And it changed from 15 liters per minute to 5 liters per minute. That really helped us to cope with the demand.
How did your staff cope with the pressure?
I think the pressure was high. Some of the staff went for self-isolation, some of the staff being ill, and people had anxiety and worried about their loved ones. But I think overall they did put themselves together really well. They worked so hard, they've been brave, they stayed extra hours, and they delivered excellent.
And how are you getting on?
I think it was a big responsibility on my shoulders. I had my own challenges at home, and I had to support staff in the hospital as well, and also deliver the service. I think staff did really well, and we worked as a team, and I think we delivered well, and I felt really proud that I have this job and I am able to contribute to the excellent care and treatment that Kingston Hospital giving to the COVID patients.
Mariam, thank you. Now to Drishti Rama in North Middlesex. Drishti, North Middlesex has a very large ethnic minority community, and we all know that ethnic minorities have been disproportionately affected by the virus. How anxious did that make you all feel?
Yes, so at North Mid, we are very proud to serve such a diverse population. In fact, when the pandemic first started, we, along with the rest of the country, were still learning about COVID-19. We, in fact, were one of the first trusts to experience a surge with people with COVID-19 coming into the trust. Now, local health watchers in our community have informed us that communities such as the Kurdish and the Turkish ones do experience certain problems when trying to access healthcare. So, for example, things like language barriers. And of course, that is why at North Mid, our focus remains on reducing health inequalities and addressing the needs of the local population that we serve.
What did your trust do to respond to that challenge?
So, at the trust, and especially as the clinical engineering department, we knew that we were in a position where we suddenly had to support the trust with increasing the number of ITU beds. And of course, as the clinical engineering department, suddenly we found ourselves in a position where we had to deliver what was required, especially within the resources that we had. So we had to step back and completely reassess our workforce, reassess what we needed to do, and almost in a way re-engineered the workflow of our department. We were in a position where we had to start commissioning a huge amount of equipment. We sat around the table with our clinical members of staff, helping them assess their clinical needs and helping them understand what we could do to support that. We also provided near-patient technologist support with equipment and with training.
How did it feel to have the wider support of the clinical engineering community?
So, having the support of the wider clinical engineering community was absolutely vital for us here. This was a space for us to be able to access key information, to understand and maybe even share challenges that we faced as clinical engineering services around the country. But it was also a space for us to understand any key information, especially if there are any changes happening at a national level, because this is where the information were being disseminated back into the clinical engineering community.
How's it gone since? And what's happened to the profile of clinical engineering in your trust?
So with the service that we have delivered and we continue to deliver in the trust, our profile has absolutely been raised because our colleagues, of course, now understand far better the intricacies of what we deliver. In fact, we were part of the COVID operational review group, where the necessities to develop the service was actually recognised, which means that we are now in a position where we've looked at the service and looked at where we can develop. And we're in the process of recruiting into some substantive roles that will enable us to carry on with growing the service at the Trust.
Fantastic, Drishti. Thanks. Now, COVID also had a major impact on other services, like the Northern Ireland Regional Glaucoma Service. George Dempsey is Head of Clinical Engineering and Physiological Sciences at Northern Ireland's Regional Medical Physics Agency. George, what happened to the glaucoma service?
Yes, well, the glaucoma service, like many outpatient services, actually stood down during the initial phase of COVID. In the case of this service, it's actually a regional service provided by the Belfast Trust to what is the Northwest or the Western Trust. The particular clinic in which it operates was actually taken over for the management of COVID patients. So the equipment, the specialised equipment, had to actually be put into storage.
How did you plan to get it up and running again?
Well, actually, the plan was driven by our consultant clinician who required the service to be operational. And the only way of doing that was to actually find another site, which they were able to within the Western Trust.
How difficult is it to move an entire service like this?
Well, actually, the equipment involves very complex equipment that needs to be networked. So we actually had to find a suitable site. We actually then, the challenge was to actually ensure that the proper networking point were there, and we were able to make that connectivity between the remote site and the Belfast Trust. The equipment itself is complex, so it needs to be set up, needs to be tested, and needs to be ensured that it's operational from the patient side.
What particular challenges did clinical engineers have to overcome?
Well, the clinical engineering specialism in this case is actually our clinical computing colleagues, so that requires other skills outside of your typical clinical engineer, which would be to maintain equipment. So that means having a knowledge of the actual equipment, but also the applications that run on that equipment. And that meant that we were challenged by ensuring that, for instance, the application could run over that network. So it was a combination of our engineers setting up the equipment and then our clinical engineering computing personnel actually testing the application to ensure it was operational for our clinicians to use.
How did clinicians respond?
Well, actually, the clinicians were amazed and delighted that we were able to get the service up and running very quickly. In fact, probably within a week of getting the equipment set up, and more importantly, they get the actual ICT connections made and the applications running. This meant that the critical patient service of assessing patients that potentially could go blind, those assessments could proceed as normal. So they were absolutely delighted.
How do you think your work has affected the profile of clinical engineering in your trust?
Right, well, the profile of clinical engineers has been raised nationally, as you can see from examples across the 4 nations. In this particular case, we're highlighting the other skills that clinical engineers provide, such as in clinical computing. So it is important that we highlight the need for clinical engineering in supporting the management of complex healthcare technology.
Thank you so much. That's just one of the hundreds of individual stories of clinical engineers going above and beyond to get the job done. This one is brilliant. Jonathan Silver is from St George's in South London. Now, Jonathan, you were short of monitor arms. Tell me firstly, what are monitor arms and what was the problem?
So, one particular occasion, we needed to move one of our temporary intensive care units from one ward to another ward. And I had a wonderful, strong team of about 20 engineers behind me helping. But when we got there, we realised that some of the vital mounting components to allow us to put the intensive care monitors up on the wall weren't there, and we didn't have any. So we were a bit stuck. We couldn't do what we needed to do. And we went home knowing that the ward wasn't quite ready. Unbeknown to us, one of our team, who was actually a rehabilitation engineer from one of our community hospitals who'd been seconded to work with us, had snuck back to his own hospital, fabricated new arms for us out of steel, and come back during the night and fitted them all ready for us to go in the morning. So when we came back in the morning, it was all ready to go and we could start moving patients in.
That's a fantastic story. Is it typical of what was going on at the time?
Oh yes, there's been a huge amount of dedicated work being done, but even more notably, certainly in my organisation, there's been a great levelling. And so hierarchy has been so much less of an issue when we've been in crisis. What it means is if you need something to be done, you talk to the person that can help you do that. And that has provided this wonderful freedom. And it's meant that we've achieved so much more than we would have done if there'd been this overriding sense of hierarchy still. And it's made for a really nice atmosphere in which we've been able to do lots of really good work.
How does it make you feel as a team when people are coming together like this?
I've been so grateful for this team. They've been very, very dedicated, and they've all taken time out of their normal work. In some cases, they work with patients in providing services that we can't provide during this pandemic. So they've been able to come and work with us, and they've learned very, very quickly. Nothing has been too much. The number of people that have been here at the weekend when we've needed to be just to get something done has been really, really heartening. And we wouldn't be able to do that without that immense support.
And how prepared are you for a second spike?
Well, from an engineering point of view, we're a lot more prepared. Over my left shoulder, there's a very large number of ventilators and monitors and syringe pumps. Something that's going to be very different this time, though, is that we stopped everything to deal with the patients that were coming in unwell in March and April. And now there's a huge amount of pressure for us to continue all of our elective work, continuing looking after unwell patients that don't necessarily have this disease. And that's going to be a really big problem in terms of our resources. So it's going to be a very different experience. And I think it's too early to say whether we're going to do really well this time or not. But we're more prepared from an equipment point of view. And I have so many spreadsheets, I think we can only say that we're prepared from a management point of view.
Thanks. Santa has his elves, clinical engineers have their monitor arm fairies. We've now reached the end of March and the nation was in full lockdown. Modelling had indicated that the first wave of infection would peak around mid-April, Easter, with cases exceeding NHS capacity. It was hoped that lockdown would make a big difference, but nobody could take that chance. More beds had to be created just in case the worst happened. The government announced the creation of 7 Nightingale Hospitals, which would act as an overflow. Barts in London were responsible for commissioning the first Nightingale at the Excel Exhibition Centre in East London. I'm joined by 5 of that team from Barts: Malcolm Birch, Alan Wilkins, Nirmal Raj, Mary Caddis and Bazit Abdul. Describe for me the scale of the challenge you faced.
Well, the scale was astonishing. The ask was initially for 4,000 level 3 beds to be placed in the Excel, which of course was just an exhibition centre. And within a very short space of time, it was expected that we'd change that into a huge ICU.
How many beds were to be made available and how quickly?
So we had to have 4,000 in total. It was a change in landscape, but initially we worked in modes of 7 to 14 to 28, 48 and so on. So we had to have an initial 4 beds at level 3 capacity within, I think, 24 hours. We opened the Nightingale from scratch in 11 days.
What were the main hurdles?
The main challenges from the outset were really around staffing and around equipment. So staffing was a problem in the sense that we were bringing staff from all over the UK to actually help with this enterprise. And equipment was unusually brought in the sense it wasn't procured normally. It came from a central system and therefore we were never quite sure what equipment we were going to be receiving.
You have 4 other sites that you need to be worried about. How did you cope with building another one?
I think the critical point for us was teamwork. Had it not been for the 4 clinical engineering team leads and the teams that they're managing, there's no way we could have done this. That allowed me to release my time from the 4 main sites and to focus my attention with the senior management team over at the Nightingale. We had the support of theatre practitioners, the training team, clinicians and procurement in order for us to be able to complete this task successfully.
How did you manage relationships with the Army and with all the other contractors?
The Army were amazing. I mean, they were called in on day one because, of course, they're used to setting up field hospitals all around the world. They had a wonderful attitude of can do, can solve problems, and very, very supportive all the way through. Our other contractors also are similarly committed to this. It was very noticeable that, we all pulled together. We felt this was a common enterprise, and they stood up along with next to the NHS staff and got us through it.
What was the mood like during construction?
I think initially the mood was very somber. We're quite excited to be at the Nightingale in terms of that we're able to help and support the development of the hospital. But on a day-to-day basis, it was quite somber knowing that some patients may not make it through whilst others had a glimmer of hope.
Could you ever have imagined working at that speed and that pace prior to the pandemic?
I think many of us who have had careers in the NHS have experienced various terrorist attacks and major incidents, and I think the response has been well planned. But in the case of COVID, I think it was the speed with which it came and the speed with which we had to come together and make some very, very big decisions in a very, very short space of time.
How important was the public support in motivating all of you at this time?
I feel that the public support was humbling, and I felt a sense of pride and a huge sense of responsibility that we were there to actually provide a service which would have such an impact on the outcome of our patients.
Where did all the scientific and technical staff come from?
In response to COVID-19, every hospital increased their ITU capacity, plus the addition of Nightingale Hospitals highlighted the workforce gaps. So a call was made to all the healthcare science community and also to wider engineering community for voluntary redeployment.
How did you ensure that they had the right skills?
I organized a training program to upskill voluntary healthcare scientists and engineers to perform the job roles of clinical engineering and critical care healthcare science, and we call it Rapid Training Program.
Tell me more about the Rapid Training Program.
The Rapid Training Program consists of a clinical ventilation course, a face-to-face and online technical course, equipment manufacturer training, and also hospital induction. I must highlight here my colleagues Iskender Solomon and Becky East, who played a fantastic leadership role at the forefront of this program.
How quickly was the training delivered?
I'm very proud to say that we organized this training program in 5 days and upskilled 60 healthcare scientists in 6 days. And in the second phase, we trained 24 engineers to perform the role of clinical engineering.
How do you train 2,500 people by yesterday?
So education and simulation teams were able to come from all over the UK and set up training programs. These were tailored to meet the needs of the staff and their roles that they were going to be playing. The O2 was made available and we were able to set up simulation bed areas with equipment so that they could become familiar with that. And we used resources that were available via the internet that belonged to Barts Health NHS Trust, and these were there for them to access should they require it when they weren't in the clinical areas.
What's the status of the London Nightingale currently?
The London Nightingale is currently in standby training state, so that means it's got 8 beds ready to accommodate 8 level 3 patients as we stand today, with the potential to go to 425 beds in 4 weeks plus 10 days.
Thank you all. Once it opened, Professor Azan Taktak from Liverpool was one of the many clinical engineers who answered calls to work in the Nightingale. Azan, what did you do?
So I responded to a call to travel to London to help with the Nightingale Hospital in London. We spent 4 weeks there. The first week was to receive training on ventilators and maintenance of ITU devices. And then the rest of the time we were divided into teams where we did shift work on the wards, doing first-line maintenance on equipment, doing things like QA of equipment, but generally helping out on the ward, helping the clinical staff in moving patients, managing them, turning them, and so on.
You were working away from home. You were working very long hours doing something that was very tricky. How did you all cope?
It felt quite challenging at first because you walk into the ward, you see very sick patients, some of them, all of them receiving mechanical ventilation, they were sedated. And also walking around in full PPE was quite a challenge, obviously at first, but we very quickly adapted into the situation and got stuck into it.
What were the highs and the lows?
The lows were seeing sick patients and finding that some of the patients were having cardiac arrests. Unfortunately, some of them survived, some didn't. And it felt quite emotional to us. The highs on the other side was being able to help and just being able to respond in this fight against this pandemic. And also when you see patients recovering, that was quite a satisfactory experience.
What was the mood like?
Morale was very high with the staff. Everybody was very enthusiastic. They were all willing to help each other, support each other, and did the job the best they could. And I felt really privileged to be part of this team.
Thanks. We now know so much more about COVID. One thing that's become clear is that there's a long road to recovery, particularly for those who've been in intensive care. They're going to need extensive rehabilitation. Now, clinical engineering has always played a vital role here as well. Colin Gibson is Head of Rehabilitation Engineering at Cardiff and Vale University Health Board. Colin, what are the long-term implications for people recovering after COVID?
Well, there are many. Not least of which it's profound exhaustion. Many who, for example, have been in intensive care for a long time will suffer from deconditioning. They'll also perhaps have respiratory problems, heart problems, other associated complications of the disease.
How can clinical engineers help?
Well, one way that we can assist is to facilitate the discharge to home or to the community. For example, if we were to provide mobility through a wheelchair, perhaps that patient may well be ventilated, in which case we can ensure that the ventilator and the wheelchair are put together in combination, along with perhaps other equipment such as oxygen sats monitor or other devices, a suction device, for example, if somebody has problems with fluid in their throat as a result of the ventilation. Those are the sorts of things that we can do as a package to facilitate their transfer to home and then their ongoing care whilst they're home.
How much support are patients likely to need in their ongoing recovery from clinical engineers?
Well, just picking up that example of someone who's ventilated at home, then of course long-term ventilation care, so providing and making sure that that equipment does what it's supposed to do and it meets the needs of that individual, because everybody is different. And how the symptoms of the disease manifest themselves, and particularly the aftermath of the disease, is different with every person. So making sure that that equipment does what it's supposed to do and it's available and functions well when needed.
What's the role of clinical engineers in long-term respiratory care?
Well, of course, there are many risks associated with long-term respiratory care, not least of which if the ventilator equipment and other related equipment doesn't work as it's supposed to at any time, then the individual is put at severe immediate risk of harm. So to be able to respond quickly is absolutely essential. That said, of course, the medium to long-term care and risks associated with promoting independence and facilitating recovery are also substantial, although the timescales are less critical.
Terrific, thank you. So clinical engineers were no longer in the background. They were being recognised for their essential role and for their leadership at trust, regional and national levels. Dee, welcome back. How has your role changed over the last 6 months?
I think that if you told me 6 months ago that I'd be speaking to the Cabinet Office and advising them about medical equipment concerns, then I wouldn't have believed you. So my role's changed quite significantly, as have the roles of many clinical engineers who really stepped up to face new challenges. So a big part of that role has become engaging with networks more actively, drawing on specialist insight from engineers who we have in our system, and really helping to unlock that so it's brought to bear in these national decisions. So my role's changed quite significantly in those regards.
Tell us about some of the forums that you've been asked to contribute to during the crisis.
So lots of the forums that we have set up have been peer-to-peer forums with clinical engineers involved. Apart from more engaged dialogue between all the equipment specialists within our own trust, we have an increased dialogue across our city, in London in this case, so that we can pool resources and have a more consolidated voice when we're speaking to national issues. So each week we would meet in a London network, and also as a London lead, I would meet with clinical engineering leads from around the country.
Has the perception of the role of clinical engineers changed, do you think?
I think the perception of clinical engineers has changed in a number of ways, and I think part of that is internally. I'm quite sure now that we even surprise ourselves at what this professional group is able to achieve. And that's reflected externally as well. So our colleagues in other areas and specialisms have a greater appreciation of what we contribute in different situations, not just in a pandemic situation, but in the fundamentals of how our healthcare system works.
What do you feel about the role of clinical engineers going forwards?
I think there's so much scope for the role of clinical engineers to expand. The leadership and the ingenuity that's been shown, and also some of the challenges that we face in healthcare, in health services, have also been exposed. So bringing those two things together, I think that engineers can go a little bit further beyond their professional boundaries, the traditional ones, and look to solve more problems to improve the system.
Didi, thanks so much. Vin Diwakar is Regional Medical Director for London, and he's in no doubt about the importance of the role clinical engineering has played.
We in London had to respond to a very rapid rise in the number of patients with COVID-19 being admitted to intensive care units across the capital. Our clinical engineers played an absolutely critical role in enabling us to respond to that so magnificently. They received, tested and deployed ventilators across intensive care units in London. They helped us develop, build, deploy and admit our first patients to the Nightingale Hospital within 16 days of it first being conceived. They helped us work through our oxygen supply, ensuring that all trusts had robust systems to run the ventilators. They took staff who were unfamiliar with the new kit that was coming through and trained them, including spending time around the bedside to help staff use the equipment and sort out snagging issues. This was quite an unfamiliar environment for them. On a more strategic level, they used their systems thinking to find solutions to problems such as renal replacement therapy and the supply chain. And outside the NHS, in industry, you responded to the ventilator challenge. The Royal College enabled rapid training of non-clinical engineers and enabled us to recruit a new workforce into the NHS. I'm so grateful to you all that you went the extra mile in responding to the needs of the patients and our population. You are just as much heroes as the doctors and nurses that you see on the front line, on our television screens and in our newspapers and on websites. Thank you so much for all your contribution, and I look forward to working with you all in the months and in the years to come. Take care.
Together with Professor Dame Sue Hill, CSO for NHS England, we head up a profession of over 65,000 healthcare scientists in the NHS and wider healthcare system. One really important group of the healthcare science workforce is our clinical engineers. Across the UK, there are more than 160 clinical engineering services operating within different hospitals and healthcare facilities. We have had a truly unprecedented and truly amazing response from our clinical engineers, and I have had the honour and privilege to chair the National Clinical Engineers Network, with representation from England, Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland. Our clinical engineers will be key to the recovery of our NHS services, and already they are supporting the return of endoscopy services and the rollout of mobile testing units. We need to learn from the great beneficial changes that have taken place through this pandemic, and our national network of clinical engineers is collating and sharing these lessons learnt. We also need to inspire the next generation of clinical engineers. So we will be working with STEM, professional bodies and the Science Museum to raise the profile of this truly amazing workforce, without whom we would have been in a much more critical place through this pandemic. I would like to take this opportunity to thank each and every one of our clinical engineers for everything that they have done and the incredible work that they continue to do.
The work of clinical engineers has been absolutely critical in bridging that key gap between getting the equipment and getting it into service with clinical teams in a way that is safe and effective for patients.
Clinical engineers have been extremely useful in helping us provide safe patient care. They've been very good in getting all our faulty equipment back to us very promptly, and they were excellent in being able to source and provide us with equipment to more than double our bed capacity for critical care.
Their knowledge and ability to solve operational problems on a day-to-day basis has helped in all kinds of ways, from providing key bits of equipment when they weren't there, to finding workaround solutions, but also to helping their clinical colleagues make the best of the equipment that they've got.
I don't think we could get through a pandemic without the help of the clinical engineers.
Clinical engineers are really cool people. I've never worked with such amazing problem solvers who just rise to every challenge that we've got. I've got goosebumps talking about it. They committed themselves wholly to ensuring that patients could breathe, that we could do all the diagnostics that we needed to do with them. They stepped up to the supply chain challenge. They were able to think both nationally, regionally, within their trusts, and then around the bedside. They delivered training, they delivered leadership, and they delivered the equipment that we needed to keep patients alive. And I'm really, really grateful that we have them in the NHS. Actually, that's really emotional for me. They were really good.
The story of COVID is still being written, and whilst the role of doctors and nurses is clear and applauded by the public, the vital part that clinical engineers have played is only just beginning to be appreciated. They remain an essential battalion in our fight against this virus. Thanks to everyone for taking part and sharing their stories. Thanks to you for watching.